Hey, just as a quick heads up before we get started, I go pretty deep into Soma Bringer spoilers here. So if you are planning on Soma Bringer and playing that, just as a heads up, you probably shouldn't listen to this unless you don't care. Also, I get into spoilers for other Monolith Soft games too as well. But the big one that I go deep into is Soma Bringer here. So hello, everyone, and welcome to One Control Port Podcast. This is a mini podcast, actually, because I don't think we'll go on too long. Hopefully, we'll see. If you don't know, I'm in Japan right now, so I am not recording a podcast, an oral podcast. However, what we have done in the past previously is make tier lists for games, but I won't be doing an entirely new tier list. I will be doing a addendum to a previous tier list we did for Monolith Soft games, and the reason why is because I have just finished up Soma Bringer. I got the main story done. There's like some side quests left that I can still do, and I might go back and finish those up just to see what kind of story's there. There's like some extra missions that unlock after you finish the game as well. But, I finished the main story for now, and I think I feel pretty comfortable basically putting Soma Bringer on my list. We previously did this with Xenoblade Chronicles 3 when it came out. That was a longer video, but I think with that video, it'd been a little bit since I had ranked Monolith Soft games, so I wanted to kind of take time to revisit them and re-tier them. This time around, it hasn't been as long, and I've gone through this list a couple times just to kind of figure out if I wanted to move anything, and I think the answer was pretty much no, not really. So in talking about today, we're just going to really focus on ranking Soma Bringer on this list. So if you don't know, Soma Bringer, 2008, Nintendo DS RPG, and so basically is a really interesting time in Monolith Soft's life, because it was basically after they got sold to Nintendo. They made Endless Frontier that year, which I believe Namco still published in Japan, and they kind of seem to like still have these little projects they used to do where like Namco would come knocking on the door, be like, Project Cross Zone time, right? And that game, I don't know for sure, but I believe that kind of fit within that thing. I have to go back and double check, but Cosmos is in the game, so that's enough. And I think the Super Robot Tyson stuff in general is like a Bandai thing as well, right? So Namco Bandai, I believe. I believe at the time that may have been the Namco Bandai combined project, but I could be wrong. And then also Disaster Day of Crisis, which is more or less, as far as I understand, a Nintendo project that they kind of put them on a task to do as like, hey, make a Wii game that uses the motion controls, right? And that, it wasn't necessarily intended to be along the lines of their traditional games. So Soma Bringer feels like an actual continuation of what they're doing with the Baten Kaitos series, what Xenosaga was, but with the key difference being it's an action RPG, right? Which, when we talk about Xenoblade, it's kind of not necessarily too surprising, but, this is before Xenoblade, and it's a kind of a different kind of action RPG, because Xenoblade is more of like that MMO style kind of like auto attack. You can move around, but like it doesn't really matter to the combat a lot of times, where Soma Bringer actually plays a lot like a Diablo game, where it's kind of like your top or isometric perspective kind of thing, and you can kind of move around to dodge attacks and things like that. It's not very smooth, I will say, in that regard. It is kind of just like stand still and hit things as long as you can, but you definitely can kind of like kite around and dodge enemies and things like that. So it's not like super engaging as an action RPG, but it is a game where you can kind of move around. With some key interesting aspects of it being that they include the break system in this game from Xenosaga Episode 3. And, being an action game means that it gets implemented in a different way, right? You're breaking somebody in combat, and then you have like these skills that can juggle enemies and things like that, which is kind of cool and more or less kind of ends up being what is Xenoblade Chronicles, has later, where you can launch enemies and kind of have them, deal extra damage to them when they're in the air. Where this game, it's more about controlling somebody when they're in the air, similar to like an Endless Frontier almost kind of thing. Sorry, talking about in Monolith Soft terms here. And if you haven't watched those old tier lists, I recommend you go watch those to figure out why things are on the list and where and how I feel about certain games. I think generally all that stuff is still in place here for the most part. There's some slight differences, I'm sure. I'm sure I've changed some small opinions on these games, but in reviewing it, there's nothing that I felt like was a major upset in how I felt about these games. So I'm going to go ahead and put Soma Bringer on this list. I'm going to kind of generally try to vaguely feel out where it is. So just as a heads up, if you listen to the, or if you watch the podcast, or you no longer watch the podcast, listen to the audio version, this podcast on YouTube actually has video of my face and everything, because I'm showing the tier list and I want to be able to show you the tier list as I move it around. If you're using the audio one, I will try my best to give you general ideas of where things are and stuff like that. I know it's a little hard because this is a complicated list of, well, not complicated, but there's a lot of games on this list on different tiers, right? Kind of thing. So Anyways, to give you just like a quick rundown on this list, just to let you know where things are at. Xenosaga Episode 3, F tier, basically out of the conversation here. Project Cross Zone, also D tier, out of the conversation here. Disaster Day of Crisis is at the top of the C tier, with Xenoblade Chronicles 3 following that, and Xenogears before that. Let me reverse this, actually, since I'm starting from the bottom. Xenogears at the bottom of the C tier, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, mid-C tier, Disaster Day of Crisis, high C tier. We are in the B tier. We have games like Xenosaga Episode 1. Above that, Endless Frontier, Xenoblade Chronicles X. At the top, we have Baten Kaitos. A tier, we got Xenoblade Chronicles 2 at the bottom, Xenosaga Episode 2 at the top. And then S tier, we got Xenoblade Chronicles at the bottom, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Torna at the middle, and then Baten Kaitos, the original one, at the top. So where I'm thinking Soma Bringer is going to go on this list is probably around the B and C tier range. And I think the reason why is a couple things. One, there's a lot of really cool things about Soma Bringer in terms of like why it deserves being that high. And I think it's mostly, storytelling and also art style wise and world wise. I think it's a really cool world overall. And it definitely feels like some interesting, like, kind of midpoint between, like, a Baten Kaitos and, like, a Xenoblade Chronicles. I think the actual artist who does Xenoblade Chronicles backdrops is the artist who did that in Soma Bringer, actually. And a lot of the backgrounds feel that, I don't know how to put it, but, like, Xenoblade Chronicles 1, at least, and I feel like Soma Bringer 2 has this, like, weird, I would say almost, like, plump nature to it. Like it's a lot of nature, and, like, everything just feels a little exaggerated in a way that it feels a little bigger than it actually is, which I think is like kind of neat and cool. But like visually, it's a really impressive game, even though you get to look at it on a DS, unfortunately, to really, I think, get the benefits of it. Like the original DS screen, not blowing it up on a 3DS, right? And it's just like a really nice looking game, especially like the set pieces and things like that. There are some issues with that. I'll get into that in a little bit. And then also story-wise, I think it is, while definitely flawed in a lot of ways that Monolith Soft stories are flawed. There's like, it has that problem where a chunk of the cast gets kind of left out. There's almost like a cast food pyramid here, where you have like the maid lady at the bottom of this list who's in your party, and she is like, they kind of mention at some point she's like a part of the church or something, and she's like maybe spying on you, but then decides, actually, I don't want to do this more. I just want to be part of your group. There's like no drama around it. She just kind of says it to the church and then leaves, kind of thing. So like, there's not a lot to it. And you kind of never really hear from her again outside of just like the general dialogue she says, right? And like, I feel like there's different tiers of characters in this game, where some characters have, important roles from just being like kind of banter characters. There's like a couple of girls in the party that just kind of like bicker and fight with each other a lot of times. And, more than anything, it's just trying to show the relationship between these two girls, while aggressive, that they have a closer relationship as friends within this company, kind of thing, right? And then you have some characters that fall more into like the mentor range, with like the captain and the vice captain, and a lot of their story, I think, is more about kind of things that have happened in the past to them, and how that changes how they treat people now. And how it kind of led to where they are in their life right now. With the captain, it's his sister, I believe, passing away, and just feeling like he wasn't there for her in a lot of ways. And then also with the vice captain, it's like his squad basically getting abandoned during like an encounter, and more or less, holding a grudge because there was like his squad was basically just kind of flown over by this one ally at the time. And they just kind of ignored them because they're like, it's going to be too much trouble to try to save these people, basically. So there's kind of like that. So I think that's like a lot of interesting dynamics to each story, but I feel like they're kind of all segregated to different characters. And so there's not a lot of characters all the times I think feel somewhat incomplete because of that. But I think the stories they do tell with those characters is interesting with it. And I think part of the reason why they maybe did this was because there's a lot of characters you can play in the game, and no character is like the main character you play, but the main character, Welt, is really the main character, despite, you not necessarily having played him. I did play him, but you didn't necessarily have to. Or like, I don't know if main character is the right word, because the real main character is another character called Idea. And so Welt and Idea are kind of like the boy and girl pair here, right? Love interest kind of thing. The Shulk and Fiora, the Rex and Pyra kind of thing, right? And so they're like they're the top pair, and they get the full treatment as they usually do with this kind of thing. And there's this one other guy I should mention. There's a fellow who's like a part of the church as well, and he is like world-wise is actually pretty important, and one of the antagonists has like a relationship with them. So like he has his own purpose of kind of telling this story about like, you know, this person he essentially grew up with, basically ending up on the other side, and like how you deal with that, and like having to fight against them kind of thing. It's a little shallow in its execution, I will say, overall, but I do think he as a character is really good, and he feels definitely more mature out of like the younger characters of the group, despite kind of still being their age. But he has a lot of like history with like the church and things like that, and like working with other people, where these other people are more just like, oh, I just kind of came out of wherever, you know, and ended up in the military, which I kind of appreciate that, you know, you're in this world saving group and there's a couple people there that just kind of feel like they're just kind of there. And like, they don't need to be especially special, but they still kind of play their own role in the party. I think maybe the maid is the one exception to that, where she feels like she just is underutilized in almost every way, I feel like. So, but yeah, so like with Welt and Idea, I think they have like really strong story dynamics there. And I think that's like, Idea is maybe one of my favorite Monolith Soft heroine characters. Like, I think she's really independent and really strong as a character. She feels a little bit like Pyra in a lot of ways to me, where I do not like Pyra, which is something to know about me. Like, I think, I don't dislike Pyra, but I think Pyra is kind of a nothing character in a lot of ways. I think she's... It's been a long time since I played Xenoblade Chronicles 2, right? So, like, the finer details are always going to be lost when you start thinking about stuff you played, like, what feels like almost getting close to 10 years ago at this point, right? But, Pyra, as a character, is kind of, like, aware of most of the happenings in Xenoblade Chronicles, right? And from the beginning, for the most part, from my memory of that. And in a lot of ways, like, she has a mission that she's trying to do and getting to Elysium, right? And essentially stopping whatever going to. I won't go into the ending of that game, but yeah, she has this one singular mission. And in some ways, like, no matter what happens with the rest of the party, she's going there no matter what, right? Nothing will really change that. And so Rex is along the ride with her on that, right? Idea, I think, is a little more interesting because, you know, it does use that trope of like, oh, I woke up and I have amnesia kind of thing. But I think Idea kind of quietly gets to that point in a lot of ways, where she starts out not really knowing anything about her. In a lot of ways, like, her requests come off as very selfish early on, but it is very much like, I'm trying to learn about myself. And I think as she learns more, it kind of gets like twisted into this thing of just like, not twisted is a very negative word to use, but it gets transformed into this thing where it's more of like, she kind of knows what's going on, but like the more she knows, the harder it is to tell anyone anything kind of thing, right? And I like that by the end of the game, there's a lot of just like talk about like, hey, we're your friends, you can trust us kind of thing. And she never denies anything that they find out about her, right? There's this whole thing at the end where basically she has like a piece of there's like the Apocrypha keys or whatever, and that gets removed from her. And she's like, oh, without this, I'm dying. Like, and I will die within, you know, whatever period of time, right? And she doesn't really tell anyone about that. And then people kind of figure that out. And then she's like, yeah, not going to say that's wrong kind of thing. She's not going to hide it kind of thing. But she doesn't answer a lot of questions. And there's also this other character that like Orpheus that also doesn't answer a lot of questions, right? And so it feels like this whole thing where like she isn't really hiding things, but she is like selectively leaving out a lot of information just to protect everybody else in the group for knowing like what's going on. Cause like realizing at some point that like by the end of this, I'm gone. I'm done. I'm not dead, but I am a magic ghost in space, basically is what happens. And so I like that kind of story arc and how that develops the idea. I think it takes a while to come into its own in a lot of ways. But yeah, so I think that's like the really positive parts of Soma Bringer in a lot of ways, like the art style, the story, how the characters are integrated despite them, you know, maybe not being the best integration at times. And I think I do want to do like I don't know, I'm not going to promise anything. I think there's a possibility to do a Soma Bringer video in the future that hopefully explains these things a little more in detail. I know on this thing, it's kind of, you know, all over the place up in the air as I kind of explain things, but I'm not claiming to be thinking about these things in a like, airproof way of like, there's no argument against it, right? Especially with something like Pyra and like me not really remembering like how exactly she's executed, right? So there's that. But the reason why I can't take it up to like an A or an S tier is kind of two major reasons. One, well, let me hold off on saying not A tier. I can't put it in an S tier because the dungeon design, beautiful game, but the dungeons in the game are very samey, very hard to navigate, I think. I mean, there's a map, you can get around that way, but like everything kind of looks the same. And they're very long dungeons too. And it just doesn't really feel that interesting to actually play and explore. Or maybe before we say play, let's just say interesting to explore. None of the areas feel good to explore, which really, because of how long the dungeons are, I think really starts to drag on you. And there's times I actually was like just kind of groaning at playing this game because I'm like, it's going to be like an hour or more until I'm out of this dungeon. And there's plenty of times to stop, right? So if you are cool like playing it in bite-sized chunks, which as a mobile DS RPG, right? Like, absolutely, you can do that. And I think that is a point of the game you can point as a strength. Is like there's these warp points everywhere, so you can kind of continue and kind of you could look at dungeons as like mini points between these two dots essentially. But I don't think like it conveys that through the story and how it's broken up, and also how the visuals are broken up and things like that. So it doesn't feel that way. So like I like to just wrap up a dungeon all at once, and it's just this long process of just going through this dungeon, and it's like all looks the same. So there's that part of it. Second part of it, combat. There is nothing wrong with Soma Bringer combat-wise. It plays like a Diablo game, basically. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. I have not played Diablo 3. I'm going to say that right now. Diablo 4 is coming up soon. I don't know where the developments of that franchise has gone since Diablo 2. And Diablo 2 probably would be a more correct contemporary connection to make here anyways. But, at the end of the day, I don't know where that space has gone. So maybe this game has aged in a lot of ways. Let me put it like that. I don't know. But for me, as somebody who likes Monolith Soft games, it's a system that, with the exception of the break system, where you can essentially kind of break and launch enemies in the air and things like that. It's a very straightforward action RPG where you just basically assign points to skills and put those on your hotbar. And those skills, do have some different impacts and things like that. But it doesn't feel connected. And I think this is like kind of what the problem Xenoblade Chronicles solves in some ways, right? Where like different party members have different skills that let you break, topple, launch. A lot of times, Soma Bringer just feels like you're mashing. And like if it breaks, cool. But otherwise, does not matter. You have your NPCs with you. You're not really coordinating. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this before. This is a multiplayer game. It was one of the, part of that DS wireless multiplayer RPG boom in Japan, local wireless only. And so that's maybe something to consider. I did not play it local multiplayer wireless because I do not have anyone around me who would play Soma Bringer. So, at least in this day and age, they wouldn't. So it is something that I think is worth considering. But as a single player game, it feels very monotonous. I feel like you kind of end up picking the one move that kind of does the most damage. And that is kind of what you kind of focus on. You put all your stats into that. So the stat upgrades are completely customizable as far as I can tell. And they are permanent. So if you make your character a certain way to the stats, you cannot change them as far as I can tell. So, it sucks, but you got to kind of make sure you know what you want to do from the beginning, essentially, right? And so I made kind of like what would be like a Final Fantasy Paladin build with like a mix of like strength, vitality, and magic for healing and holy magic kind of thing. And what I ultimately ended up doing was like going with a holy magic setup, essentially, which in a lot of ways kind of undermined the break system because I couldn't do any kind of like toppling or toppling's probably not the right word. Well, there's like a knockdown. It's basically toppling. like toppling, launching, and things like that. Like I couldn't really contribute to that part with the holy magic as much, kind of thing, because there weren't really as many things assigned to that. It's more of melee attacks who had that. And I found the holy magic to be more potent than melee stuff. So eventually I stopped upgrading my strength, and I couldn't take the strength out, unfortunately. So just all those stats was basically wasted. And then I'd like level up the holy stuff. But I think it's a good game in terms of the sense of you can make your own character and a lot of customization and stats, and you can basically choose the skills you want from a class, right? And there's like 5 sets of skills per class. I don't know if there's like a lot of overlap or not, or if there's any overlap, honestly. Unfortunately, because you're locked into your class and stuff, like you can't really test things out either. So, you kind of have to pick something from the start and just kind of hope it works out for you in a lot of ways. So I think those are like my 2 major problems, which if you know me, combat is a big deal in Monolith Soft games. And if you fail combat, you're going to end up pretty low on this list. Generally. Soma Bringer maybe gets an exception to that rule, mainly because I think what Soma Bringer does specifically that makes me like it a lot is it does a lot with a little, I think. And I feel like a lot of times Xeno games don't know when it's too much. You can say that about the combat too, and I think I personally prefer the combat to be too much. So I don't want to like criticize anyone and say if you're asking for story, you're asking for too much per se. I personally am not in the Xeno, perfect work zone of caring about giant universe and like what references are there to the Bible and stuff like that, right? I don't really care about that stuff personally. But I think like Xenoblade Chronicles did a really good job of keeping like a self-contained story. But I think like Soma Bringer feels like a nice bare bones story and character execution. And in a way that I feel like there are gaps. There are a lot of, like, don't get me wrong, there's a good chunk of story. I mean, there's still hours of cutscenes in this game. There are gaps in I think Soma Bringer's storytelling, but I think they're like small enough gaps that once you've kind of played the whole game, you can start piecing together a lot of those gaps in like very easy ways. It's not hard to do. You don't have to go do a bunch of like research outside the game or anything like that. You don't have to go to like a freaking wiki or something like that, right? It's just kind of something you can kind of piece together really easily in front of you and kind of realize that like these characters, while maybe not individually strong characters, I think when you start tying the entire cast together in a lot of ways, they kind of in some ways kind of make up, one strong character. And I think that's like a nice thing with it. And I also think that the story is compressed in a way where it feels like it gets its point across without getting too complicated, I think. I know I am maybe on the I still say that I'm probably on the outer ring of like Xeno fans and where they're at with storytelling in these games and what they want out of it. I think one of the biggest frustrations people have with Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is that it does not connect enough with Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Xenoblade Chronicles, which I have a different feeling on that, though I think in some ways I can kind of see that and kind of understand, how they feel and maybe agree with them, but maybe I take it the other way where I'm like, these games should be separate, where they take it the other way and say these games should be connected. But I have a lot of appreciation for that kind of more simple implementation, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think in a lot of ways, Idea's story becomes a lot more impactful because a lot of the other noise around is kind of not there. And I still think there's like plenty that could have been done to flesh out all these characters further. Like, don't get me wrong, but I think I kind of appreciate it like on the flip side of what like I typically expect from like a Xeno game or something like that, right? And I do like that some characters are less important than others in a lot of ways, but like, I mean, I kind of felt like with like Xenoblade Chronicles 2, where like, again, the spoilers of that game, everyone's like some weird like half human or dead human. A corpse that's been not possessed, but like, given life through blades and other ways, right? And I like that Morag is just like, oh, I'm the only person here that's like a normal person. And like in some ways she feels bad about it, but like I kind of appreciate that of just like, yeah, man, you're just a person being a person there, right? Like despite everyone being these weirdos and getting chests like crystals embedded in their chests because they almost died, you're just like, yeah, I'm just here. It's still on par with everyone kind of thing, right? And I kind of like that like a lot of the characters in the group don't necessarily feel like they were necessarily destined to be there. They just kind of were there. So yeah. Anyways, so in explaining all that, I think we can probably place this now. Let's start at the bottom of the. Oh gosh. Let me try the bottom of the B tier. Let me feel about that. I would start at the bottom of the C tier, but the problem is trying to make the comparison to Disaster Day of Crisis is a very difficult thing. I will say this, though, and what would put this above Disaster Day of Crisis. I think in a lot of ways, Disaster Day of Crisis is a game that, while well-intended in all of the ways it's made, ultimately kind of fails as a Wii game as a whole. Obviously, it has different values than what Monolith Soft games typically are, but as a Wii game, I think it kind of fails in what it's trying to do. It doesn't keep the excitement level that the Disaster Day of Crisis name, I think, kind of gives to that game. Or like the presentation that game gives. I think that there's too many periods of downtime in that game that don't feel like you're in a disaster a lot of times. So I think it fails at that illusion. Where I feel like Soma Bringer, while there are problems I have with the combat and stuff like that, I don't think it ever fails per se. I think it just is, I expect more out of Monolith Soft in a lot of ways. And maybe the dungeons are a little too long kind of thing, right? That kind of deal. I think also just being a multiplayer game that I played in a single player is always kind of a weird thing. So we'll put it above the Disaster Day of Crisis here. So we're in the B tier or potentially high C tier. I don't quite know where we're going yet. Xenosaga Episode 1. I really like the combat system for Xenosaga Episode 1. I don't care about the world of the Xenosaga franchise very much, personally. Characters. Shion, I'm not a fan of Shion. I'm not a fan of... I like Momo. Momo and Ziggy are a really good pair. I love Momo and Ziggy. Are they the only characters I care about Xenosaga? I think Junior's alright. I don't love Junior. I like Junior's story better than I like Junior. But Momo and Ziggy, I think, are definitely my favorite out of that group. In some ways, I think story-wise, I am pro Soma over Xenosaga. Gameplay-wise. Dungeon-wise, I think Xenosaga is better. For sure. Gameplay-wise, I think Xenosaga is better. So I guess the question at this point is like, how much do I value the story over the big changes and the characters between the big changes, or the difference between where Soma Bringer is at gameplay-wise and where Xenosaga is. Like, how much do I... Oh, gosh. Soma Bringer's gameplay sure is something of it is a video game. Where Xenosaga, at the very least... Let me think about this. So Xenosaga has the dial system. That's cool. I like the dial system. The dial system feels like a Monolith Soft game. I like that roulette thing going on. That element of unpredictability. Soma Bringer does not have that. Xenosaga 2 has that. Xenosaga 3 does not have that. In a lot of ways, Soma Bringer feels like Xenosaga 3 gameplay-wise. Where Xenosaga 3's gameplay is incredibly fine, but incredibly unremarkable. This has something over Xenosaga 3, though, at the very least. I was about to bring it down to Xenosaga 3 level for me. No. This has something. I like the brake system still. I think it's an interesting iteration of the brake system. It's a unique iteration of the brake system that has not really been developed on further. Xenoblade, I guess, to some extent, but Xenoblade, I feel like, is not as much of an action RPG as Soma Bringer is an action RPG. Xenosaga's combat, though. We really need to focus on Xenosaga, though. It is, I think, a fairly big gap between how I feel about Xenosaga's gameplay. I feel like, to some extent, the dungeon design aspect of Xenosaga Episode 1 does not stand out to me as much as like the Baten Kaito series. It's been a long time, but it does not stand out to me nearly as much. If I were to put Soma Bringer up against Endless Frontier, how am I feeling about that? Endless Frontier, combat's really cool in Endless Frontier. World's okay. Character's very good. Okay, I think I feel pretty comfortable it being under Endless Frontier. At the very least. I just want to make sure that I wasn't underplaying where Soma Bringer would go in the first place. Oh, this is a tough one. I love the look of the world of Soma Bringer. I love the characters in Soma Bringer so much more than I love any of the Xenosaga characters. But the combat. I will say Xenosaga's combat, the first one, not my favorite. We have Xenosaga Episode 2 up there. So I feel like there is a better world where that exists. And in some ways, I kind of appreciate Soma Bringer for being the only game that they've made that feels like this. I just feel like that they could have done it a bit differently. I don't really know, actually. I really don't know what they could have done. And I feel like maybe if you played with multiplayer, if you could better coordinate with other players, there'd be funner parts of the combat rather than just trying to kind of, focus on your own class. That is my biggest fear of Soma Bringer. But we're ranking this off my experience as a single player game, and I will never play this game multiplayer. So I like the story. I like the story in Soma Bringer. I like the world of Soma Bringer a lot. I think, God, this is so hard. Sorry, I forgot this the audio version of this podcast. I am dancing between the bottom of the B tier with Xenosaga Episode 1 and Soma Bringer. Is basically where we're at. I am almost certain it is not going above Endless Frontier, which is part of the kind of middle tier of the B tier. But the question is, I feel like these games are two games that are just they have equally good points, and I can't find a way around breaking this tie. And we don't have the Disaster Day of Crisis bonus of that being a completely different game, so I can kind of, make a completely different set of expectations that set it above Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Baby boy. I also feel like there's a lot of games on the B tier, but I don't think that should matter. Part of me was like, maybe I should think about this from which one I'd rather go back and play later. But Xenosaga Episode 1, I would probably go back and play, but it's mainly because I would feel like I need to. And I feel like that's unfair as well, because I feel like Soma Bringer has an untapped potential as a multiplayer game that I do not see. So I feel like, in some ways, I'd rather play Soma Bringer again, but with multiplayer. So I think that's not a very good comparison. Xenosaga feels like more of a Monolith Soft game. I take that back. Soma Bringer feels like a Monolith Soft game. I sometimes I think I overemphasize combat and things like that. I think Soma Bringer is just going to be a hair above Xenosaga. I think there are so many more things I like about Soma Bringer's story and character-wise than I like the Xenosaga universe. I know for Xenosaga fans, that's, maybe not the greatest thing. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of things I appreciate about what Soma Bringer did story-wise in a Monolith Soft game. And in a lot of ways, it feels like the template for what came later. But there's a lot of things I think that it does better than some of those later games, all right? I forget if I mentioned earlier, but I think Idea might be my favorite heroine of the Monolith Soft franchise. And I do have a lot of characters in here I like. And I like a lot of their motivations. And I like that some of their motivations are very minor motivations. Sometimes you're just living to live. And I appreciate that. you know. Yeah, all right. I'm locking it in. Soma Bringer on the B tier, below Endless Frontier, above Xenosaga Episode 1. I think that feels like a good place for it. I wish I liked Soma Bringer more. There may be a day where I like Soma Bringer more. I will say, ever since I beat Soma Bringer, my opinion on it has only improved. And, you might be like, well, how does that happen? I think it's kind of like, in some ways, it's like the Wizard of Oz Beyond the Yellow Brick Road effect on the DS. Like, if you didn't see my review of that, I did a review of that. Where, like, most moments of playing Wizard of Oz Beyond the Yellow Brick Road was incredibly boring. But when I wrapped up the experience at the whole and thought about it at the end and put all the story pieces together and, like, what that game was doing together, I thought it was just, like, so much... I was such a good and interesting game. And, like, even if it didn't get to where it needed to be, it created the outline of an image of what it needed to be. And I don't think necessarily, like, a sketch is as bad as, or is valueless in a lot of ways, right? And I feel like Soma Bringer feels like a game that feels maybe more like a sketch than it does like a complete picture. But I feel like the sketch itself is very, very strong. And part of me kind of wishes I could have seen this game with different gameplay. But I feel like that, when I say that, obviously that's unrealistic. What is more realistic is if I played this game multiplayer someday. I feel like there's the potential that there could be some interesting stuff there. And I think I will go back and play this game with a different class, at least a little bit. Not a lot, but I think a little bit. But yeah, I feel pretty happy with that. I feel pretty good. I think the B section feels a little crowded. I'm a little worried that might continue to get crowded, but when's the next Monolith Soft game coming out? We're going to have the DLC for Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and assuming that's Torna sized, we'll rank that on here as well and put that somewhere. But, chances are we're not going to have a huge list. But, we still have these games at the bottom down here I need to check out myself too. If you don't know, I haven't played about 6 Monolith Soft games. There's also like a Pied Piper game, but I think that's more or less just lost media at this point. Unless somebody jigs it up later. But that includes the Namco X Capcom game, includes Project Cross Zone 2, Xenoblade Chronicle or Xenosaga Episode 1 and 2 DS, which I hear is actually a pretty neat game, but unfortunately has not been translated as far as I know. I think it's like a menu translation, so if you want to play it in English or in Japanese but with English menus, I think you can do that. There's Xeno Freaks, which is kind of like a fan disc kind of thing. And there's Endless Frontier Xseed. And then also Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans, a game that got quite a bit expensive. So I don't think I'm going to be able to get a physical copy of that English version, but I might do that at some point. Yeah, in terms of the next Monolith Soft game, I mean, obviously the Xenoblade Chronicles DLC is going to be kind of the first and foremost thing on my mind when that comes around. I really maybe should rank what's it called separately on this list at some point. What's it called? Future Connected. I mean, that's such a small piece of content though compared to Torna. I feel like I don't think it's as substantial. Either way. So I think what I'm really dancing between right now is Endless Frontier Xseed or Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans. Endless Frontier Xseed. I'm a big fan of Endless Frontier, and I know there were improvements made, but I don't know if that's enough for me to be like really excited to play Endless Frontier Xseed, unfortunately. But I think I'd much rather play that than the Namco X Capcom and Project Cross Zone game at the very least, Project Cross Zone 2. The Dragon Ball Z game, obviously I don't think there's going to be a lot story-wise that I'm probably going to get out of it. Personally, I'm not a huge Dragon Ball Z fan, but I could see combat-wise potentially, depending on what it is. So looking forward to maybe checking that out. So I think one thing I might do, I haven't looked into like a Japanese copy of the game, but I think I might buy a Japanese copy and then just, pirate the English version, basically. I think that might be a good idea for that. Kind of save myself some money. And then at the end of the day, if I can't get a Japanese copy, whatever, right? Like, I'm not going to pay $100+ to some random person on eBay to get the right to play Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans. So yeah. I do have a copy of Endless Frontier, though, and Xenosaga Episode 1 and 2. I do not have copies of the... and Xenosaga Freaks. I do not have copies of... the Project Cross Zone 2 or Namco Cross Capcom. So, Xeno Freaks might not be a bad thing to look at some point, because I don't think it'll be anything too intensive. So the biggest thing would be just trying to appreciate it without knowing Japanese. And I don't know if there's a fan translation in the work for it or anything like that. So me practicing some Japanese would probably be good. I'm sure I'll never get to the point where I'll be good enough to read Xenofreaks, but I can try use it in combination with like a, visual novel reader on a PC or something like that to try to figure that out. So anyways, that's it. Thank you guys so much for sticking around and listening to me. I have no idea how long that was, so my recording time is off. I think maybe like 20-30 minutes, so hopefully it was interesting. Obviously, you probably need to know about the previous ones to really get a lot out of this, so if you did not go listen to those, you should go listen to those. But yeah, I think we're going to continue to revisit this list in the future, and yeah, hopefully it will be good and fun. Hopefully above, I want another game in the SNA tier rank, right? Torna was the last thing that got that high. So hopefully we're getting another Torna with Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Anyways, thank you guys so much. I'll be back from Japan here shortly. In the next, I have no idea when this is going up, but in the next 2 weeks or so. So maybe shorter, depending on if this is the first thing that goes up or the second thing. I don't know. I haven't planned anything yet. So anyways, thank you guys so much. You guys have a great week. Bye.